2, 1. We are live. Fantastic. Okay, Andy, thank you so much for joining me. This is great. I'm tickled to bits, as I mentioned in the preamble, to have a philosopher on my call today. So welcome and thank you again.
Thank you, Eddie. That's a nice thing to say. When I used to introduce myself as a philosopher at the bar, the girls would always move away from me. So,
and maybe one or two of the right girls ended up looking in your direction, and one of those was a keeper, right? Because that's a good way to weed out the crowd.
well, to be clear, it's one was a keeper, not one or two.
Right. There you go. Exactly. Yeah. Good man. Well, good. And you get the right one. Exactly. Actually, that reminds me. We were chatting in the preamble. I went to Canada just on a spur of a moment when I was 21 years old, and I met a girl hiking. And so that to me was kind of like, okay, that's the good prerequisite. Somebody that loves outdoors and nature. And we went hiking together, became best friends way before we got married and started dating. So yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, that stuck with us. All right, Andy. So I'm very fascinated in exploring a certain topic, which is this. So this podcast is dedicated toward really presentation skills and how does one find one's voice, right? That's my mantra. How do we find our voice in order to present? I focused a lot in season 1, and you're my inaugural guest for season 2. And season 1, I focused on technique, polish, how do we use tools, all these kinds of things. But oftentimes I will look at people who have massive followings. So now there's a gentleman called Jordan Peterson. He's a psychologist out of University of Toronto, huge following. Now he's from Alberta, my old, chosen province of Canada, right?
Yes.
And I would not call him, and this isn't an insult to Jordan, I've read his books, I like the guy. I wouldn't call him a polished presenter. Yeah. And yet millions of people buy his books and listen to his podcasts. His content is excellent for those people that like that kind of content, right? Okay, so this is interesting. I want season 2 to be about how do we sharpen our minds so our content is amazing. All right. Now, when we sharpen our minds, there's an interesting factor, and I lean towards cybersecurity since this is my industry, and I'll mention this. A few weeks ago, I interviewed a former KGB agent called Jack Barsky. Now, Jack Barsky was a sleeper cell agent in the United States in the 1970s. During that period of time, prior to defecting and becoming a US citizen, and he's lived with us ever since, and he's written books that are bestsellers, and now that the official secrets over what he did is over, he's able to publish all of this work. It's fascinating. I asked Jack, I said, hey, Jack, what were some of the things you got into? And he called them active measures. And I said, what's active measures? Today, we know them as disinformation campaigns.
Yes.
And I thought, wow, you hit the nail on the head, because there's so much fake news, and especially in the last 4 years of great polarization in our politics, people believe all sorts of what I would consider complete and utter nonsense.
Right.
But they truly believe it.
Yes.
And so I said to Jack, well, what were some of your disinformation campaigns? He said, well, a couple that we were most proud of. One, convincing a lot of Americans that the AIDS virus was cooked up in a CIA lab. And he said, number 2, convincing the majority of Americans who still believe it today that J. Edgar Hoover was a cross-dresser. And I said, you mean he wasn't?
I'd heard that one as well.
You got me. But what's amazing is he said, the way we do is we take a kernel of truth. He said, Hoover was likely a gay man, which in the 1920s and 30s was unfortunately problematic still back in those days. And he said, you take this kernel of truth and you spin a story around it. Back in those days, prior to the internet, you would find somebody who's, let's say, sympathetic to socialism. And then you get that story going in the media. He said, I cannot undo the lie. Right.
Fascinating.
So, your specialty, okay, I'm looking over a couple of my notes here. Your specialty, of course, is in mental immunity.
Yes.
So talk to us. And by the way, I'm just going to bring in Matt Lee, who's a great guy. No worries that you can't stay, Matt, but jump in anytime or look at the archive to add some comments. Your specialty is in mental immunity. How does one fortify one's mind against fake news? How do you even decide what fake news is? Let's start there.
That's the big question on a lot of minds these days, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm a philosopher by training, and philosophers going way back have been testing ideas and trying to help humanity understand how important it is to toss out the bad ones. So we've been actually combating disinformation or other forms of bad ideas for a long, long time. And we've learned a few things along the way. It's also true that philosophers have not done an incredibly good job of making humanity as wise as we like to think we are.
Okay.
Right? So our attempts to promote wisdom have always fallen short of our hopes. But in just the last few decades, there's a new science emerging that looks at the way the mind tries to spot and remove bad ideas, or spot and remove bad information. And its hypothesis is that bad ideas can spread virally, just like parasites can spread through a population of bodies. Bad ideas or disinformation can spread virally through a population of minds.
Right.
Moreover, each and every one of us is more or less susceptible to mind viruses or mind parasites, which is to say, if you flip susceptibility upside down, you're talking about immunity. So each and every one of us has more or less immunity to bad ideas of different kinds. And so it turns out, based on about 60 years of research now, that minds actually have immune systems that most people don't know about. Those systems function more or less well, but we can learn how to make them function better so that we become less susceptible to disinformation and other morally disorienting ideas.
And can that immunity be carried over from generation to generation in the same way? It's interesting because memory is kind of an interesting thing. We're starting to learn that memory lives in our cells, not just in our experience.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. One thing we know about the human animal is that we're born extremely suggestible and gullible. So if our parents tell us that the tooth fairy is real, we will believe it. And we'll believe it because we're programmed by our genes, essentially, to accept things on the authority of authority figures generally, but parents in particular. This makes us wide open to mind infections of different kinds. And we actually have to develop immunity. And traditionally, we've talked about this as teaching or learning critical thinking. But the concept of critical thinking turns out to be a very crude instrument for developing mental immunity. But this new science that I talk about, and I call it cognitive immunology, is giving us far more sophisticated tools for deepening our resistance to bad ideas.
So how does one develop cognitive immunity?
Right. So the short answer is that you have to learn how to test ideas in ways that are sensitive to genuinely reliable indicators of what's true and what isn't true.
Okay.
So, I mean, your story about the KGB agent or former KGB agent who spread disinformation and found that these ideas had propagated so far and become so deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness that it was almost impossible to eradicate. This illustrates some of the really key lessons of cognitive immunology. One of them is that it's a lot easier to prevent a mind infection than to cure one. So once a bad idea has taken up residence in your brain, often it becomes a belief, and then the belief becomes part of, most people regard their beliefs as part of themselves. And then when information comes along that threatens those beliefs, they feel personally threatened. Their identity feels threatened. And so their mental immune systems overreact and attack the new information, even if it's good information. Right. And so conspiracy thinking, right, is a very clear case of this kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I live in New Jersey. At Christmas time, we pop down to Princeton. They have this beautiful sort of, looks like Hogwarts, to do Christmas carols, just to sing. Yeah. And I remember my first year, this was 4 years ago, on the campus, there were flat earth theory people.
Yes.
It's Princeton University.
Yes.
Flat earth theory.
Amazing.
And they've got brochures laid out. They're there to convince you as you walk in. You kind of like, and I had to stop to talk to these guys and said, it's so simple to me. The International Space Station doesn't film a spinning disc.
Right.
It's a sphere. And yet that little bit of what I would call logic did not seem to compute.
Exactly.
It seemed like a choice on their part. What do you think?
I do think that's part of the story. So it turns out that one of the most common causes of deep mind infections, or difficult to eradicate mind infections, is wishful thinking, or what I call willful belief. So if you let yourself believe things because you want them to be true, they'll often sort of sink roots in your mind, and become tenaciously resistant to change, even though they're dead wrong. The alternative, of course, is to only believe things that you genuinely have good evidence or good reason to think is true. And there are disciplines out there that Western civilization has been developing for years. Scientist, philosopher, critical thinker. These are a skeptic. These are roles or disciplines that can strengthen the mind's resistance to bad ideas, and also get better at spotting good ones.
Right. Yeah. It's super fascinating to me that I think that people somehow, I think if you invest a lot of time into something like flat earth theory,
yes,
I think the longer amount of time people invest, the more they get sort of, I'll give you an example. So while I just said I go down for Christmas carols, I grew up very religious. I'm atheist today and I have been for many years since my first daughter was born.
Yes.
But it took a monumental, what I call kind of cataclysmic event, the birth of my daughter, to really shake my brain into challenging the concept of what I would call today an arbitrary God. Now, this is a very contentious issue, of course, because I know those people. Those were my people. I grew up like that. People will die for their faith. And we see this in the 9/11 attacks, these kinds of things. We see this in the cyber threats that, my organization and others have to hold against. There's ideology. You look at someone like Kim Il-jung. So Kim Il-jung, when they made that movie, The Interview, it just basically took the piss out of him, right? It was a very funny movie with Seth Rogen and James Franco. And he cyber attacked Sony Pictures for it, cost them $100 million in damages, and then threatened to bomb movie theaters if movie theaters showed it. So everybody backed down, and then the movie was a flop. Hilarious movie. But right, so this guy is invested in his own persona, as it were, in his own, can't take a mocking, right? There's something in his brain where, and it's the same in the religious community, is that kind of fervor that I think, you have to have what I call a cataclysmic event to sort of shake you out of it, or at least I'm saying you have to.
Well, I think for many people it's cataclysmic, and there are also gentle ways to lead people out of rabbit holes or lead people to
That's what I want to know. Yes.
Question their ideologies.
Right.
Yeah, it's not easy. When you say that the longer you live with a bad idea, the harder it is to let go of it. Psychologists call that the sunk cost fallacy. Once you've invested in anything, it becomes harder and harder to let go, even if it's a bad investment or bad cognitive investment. I have a friend a philosopher of science, who went undercover at a flat Earth convention. And
who undercover? Oh, went undercover. Oh, okay, go on.
He went undercover at a flat Earth convention, and he'd pigeonholed these ardent flat earthers and try to pin them down with questions. And he found that they're not dumb. They're, in some cases, extremely clever, but they're deeply invested. They're not open-minded. They have really weird ideas about what's reliable and what isn't. And to reach people like that, you actually have to learn to talk to people like that in a very special way, because most of the ways we have of trying to persuade people like that just get them to dig in their heels. Okay. He's got a book coming out called How to Talk to a Science Denier.
And what's his name?
Lee McIntyre.
Okay, thank you. All right.
And I think it hasn't hit the shelves yet, but he'd be a good person to this.
That's what I was asking.
To this series you're doing. I also really like your mention that it suddenly occurred to you at some point in your life that your God belief, or belief in the particular God that your family grew up in, felt arbitrary. Mm-hmm. So one of the key commitments of people who hold a scientific worldview is that they believe we shouldn't believe arbitrary things. And there are actually excellent reasons not to believe arbitrary things, because it divides us into competing camps with no conceivable way of adjudicating the dispute using reasons. Because reasons try to point to non-arbitrary considerations. And if you embrace things for arbitrary reasons, you're essentially creating a division within the human family that is eventually going to cost humanity, in some cases dearly, Liz, as religious wars.
So do you mean to say if I reply to an arbitrary argument with reason, that will create contention? That's not the right way to go about it.
Yes, sometimes. So if you become invested in an arbitrary idea and then encounter a good reason why you should change your mind, a lot of people push back, right? That's common. And they push back, by the way, because their mental immune systems have been conditioned to treat threatening information. And by the way, this means threatening to the identity you have formed, as a threat, as an enemy, and then attack that information. So to calm, you have to learn how to calm mental immune systems so they can actually hear what you have to say, so they can actually feel the force of better reasons.
So, okay, I'm going to give you a real world example. This was fascinating. It's a contentious one, and it shouldn't be. It's so silly that it is. So Facebook's latest move to ban former President Trump for 2 years on Facebook. Okay.
Yes.
Twitter, lifetime ban. So he's been silenced and put into a corner. Yet the Ayatollah of Iran, who spews death to Jews, has a Facebook profile and is on Facebook all the time. Kim Il-jung, who we just mentioned, in North Korea, who's starving his people, puts up Facebook posts all the time about how in fact, there was one just today. In preparation for this call, I just wanted to make sure he still had a page, so I was saying the truth. He does. And looking at Kim Il-jung's page, it talks about all the beautiful housing he's providing his people. We know they're starving, and the claim that there's no coronavirus. It's like, really? That coronavirus started just north of you in Wuhan, but there's no coronavirus in North Korea. We know this is not true.
Right.
So these people have a voice, and yet our American darling companies, Facebook, Twitter, the Silicon Valley companies, are finding a greater threat from the former President Trump than these guys? Doesn't make sense, right?
It doesn't. Now, in my book, Donald Trump, Kim Jong-il, and the Ayatollah are all three of them are threats to the information ecosystem that will determine whether we thrive or whether we end up in just irreconcilable conflict with one another. So I think all three of them are problematic. And ideally, a company like Twitter would enforce consistent policies across its humongous information ecosystem. But it's actually an unmanageable task. Now, I'm not saying that they should not have standards and begin to enforce them in ways that help to protect our information ecosystem from disinformation peddlers. But we've allowed these companies to get so huge and their ecosystems to become so unmanageably large that the prospect of sort of enforcing accountable talk so look, we have a major problem with unaccountable talk.
Okay.
We insist every day on our cognitive rights, my right to speech, my right to my opinion, my right to do this, my right to believe that. And we talk almost not at all about our cognitive responsibilities. And rights and responsibilities always have to go hand in hand. You can't have rights without responsibilities. And we talk about our rights endlessly, and we talk almost not at all about our cognitive responsibilities. And we have to bring those back into balance, or this information, this highly connected world we've created is going to consume itself.
Yeah, it reminds me of what I think is a wonderful little company, a company called Basecamp. Now, it's a privately held company, about 700 employees, and what they do is they do like project management software type stuff.
Yes.
And it's about a 20-year-old company. Now, the CEO sent out a note to the employees saying, "Hey, folks, because look, Silicon Valley and technologists, let's just be frank, they all lean one direction politically. So for the most part, right, it's all left leaning. Okay, fine. You can actually understand that. The left of the political spectrum are the more creative, right? You think about, Peterson puts it like chaos and order. He doesn't mean chaos in a negative sense, but chaos on the left, order on the right. Now that's true. Conservatives are pretty good at structure, right? And putting things in boxes. The left is more, this is why most professors seem to be on the left, because more creative, more unbound, the Steve Jobs types, right? And so, okay, fine. They all lean in that direction. But the fact that they do is a problem if they are pushing for one viewpoint. Now, this company, Basecamp, the CEO is getting a little bit fed up with, hey guys, we're not here as a political organization. Can we just get to work? Let's stop being so politically charged. 60% of his employees quit. They just walked out. They're like, oh no, this is our right. This is a platform. This is for us. We need to just speak. So that's really interesting. Ties beautifully into a cybersecurity dialogue, in my view, because what you're basically saying is, look, the security of this company is dependent also on the fact that you understand your responsibilities. You're here to work for the company. And yet somehow 60% of the employees had that as the number 2 responsibility as to why they're getting a paycheck, that I work here. My number 1 reason is so I can have a voice. And if I can't have a voice, I'm out of here.
Interesting.
Really?
I do think it's really important that everybody have a voice. And it's really important that everybody feel heard. And it's really important that we have the kind of dialogues where people's deepest needs get heard, understood, and ideally met. And it's really, really hard to have a conversation with 7 billion people and aggregate everybody's voices in a way that allows us to harmonize with one another, right? I mean, it's a huge problem.
Right, exactly. I'm going to get to just a couple of comments here. I didn't also tap into LinkedIn, so I don't know who user is. It's probably on my phone here. Don't worry about it. Yeah, Technocrasty versus democracy. Understood. And hey, David, thanks for dialing in. There'll be 60% to replace them, I suppose. But, in technology companies, as I say, they're all kind of leaning in one direction right now. So, yeah, Facebook have made this kind of decision to have look, they're wanting to get involved, certainly, but the logical response would be what I said: the Ayatollah, other despots around this world have a voice. So when I say that, though, I'll give you another great example. It doesn't seem to compute, and this is how I want to understand the parasites of the mind, as it were, right? The mental immunity that needs to be built up. So last November, I was at a dinner party, so it's still kind of lockdown. We're in the back garden. Things are still a little bit tense, right? I live in New Jersey, so again, vast majority of people tend to lean in one direction politically. And, I'm not a fan, so I have to say this up front. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. It's just that when people start talking about he's a racist, he's a blah, blah, I'm just not seeing the evidence. I see that he's a bombastic dickhead. I mean, that I see. Right? That seems obvious to me. But, the Russian collusion, all these kinds of things, it's like, it seems that the narrative of why he's being criticized is very much inflamed. And I try to talk about policy. Okay, what policies have affected you? Anyway, I was truly set upon, I'll have to say set upon, by a couple of women in this dinner party. In the end, I got the boot. Really interesting, right? It was because I basically wouldn't say he's a lying, philandering, scumbag piece of crap, right? I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
And what I am saying is what I described to you a little earlier. But I clearly put myself in a different camp to them because I wouldn't join that narrative. Right. So what I was trying to do was reply with what I thought was logical, right? With, what are the policies that are affecting you that are so bad that you hate this man so much? And not one could be named, not one policy. And so how do I have this conversation other than just being yelled at? And oh, by the way, and then it was, well, then, if you're not saying this, you're a racist too. That card came out real fast. Yeah, it's very bizarre, right?
And it's certainly not constructive, right? You don't dialogue with accusations of racism flying fast and thick. There's no way to have a constructive conversation when when conversation becomes accusatory that way. One of the things I like to say is that if you're reasoning to win instead of reasoning together to find out, you're sowing the seeds of the destruction of your mind's immune system, or at least compromising your mental immunity.
Of my own when I try to do that.
So yes, so if you become a culture warrior and reason in order to defeat perceived enemies, you're training your mind's immune system basically to fight for an ideology rather than to find the truth.
Right. That was what I was doing. That's right.
Well, you were, but maybe the people you were talking to were as well. Right? This is what happens.
Sure.
This is what happens in culture wars, right? Mental immune systems get inflamed. Everybody finds enemies and start using reasons as weapons. Now, if you use reasons as weapons, you may gain a short-term sense of satisfaction by bludgeoning somebody over the head with whatever you think of as a good reason. But down the road, your mind will be less sensitive to genuinely reliable information. The way to get past a culture war is for all of us to come back to treating reasons not as weapons, but as pointers we can use to genuinely direct one another's attention to relevant considerations. That's what reasons should be for. And if you want reasons to work well and give you deep immunity to bad ideas, you have to make a habit of using them that way.
Okay, I like that. The gently bringing them to, what was that?
Yeah. So think about the little laser pointers people use to point to different things on a slide, on a PowerPoint slide. Think of a reason as like that, a pointer that draws your attention to something that's relevant. So right now I'm using reasons, Eddie, to just basically say, pay attention to this, pay attention to this. You can see those are relevant, right? So I'm using reasons as pointers to deepen to strengthen your mental immune system. And we can all do this, and every conversation we have is an opportunity to develop our immunity, which is also a way to, I think it puts us on a path to wisdom. If we do this habitually, I think we become wiser.
Well, and David's chiming in here saying it goes back to where is the logic and thinking of the evidence. So using a pointer to point to logic, and I suppose evidence is probably bigger than logic, because the logic doesn't, well, go back to my flat earth people though. It didn't work in that sense, although I was trying to win an argument. So I was definitely trying to do that because I got a little bit of a combative nature to me, right? So I kind of like that.
I've been there.
Yeah. So while I was trying to win an argument, it was like, guys, it's not a spinning disc. That's logical thinking and evidence. Right. Something in their mind just wouldn't take that.
Yeah. Well, it turns out people are often more attuned to the usefulness of ideas than to their truth. So if an idea feels useful, a lot of times I'll hang on to it and use it, even though the evidence for it is extremely shaky. And if evidence comes along and points to the shakiness of an idea I find useful, I'm likely to get defensive.
Right.
And one of the things I do in the book is say that historically, science has tried to say, focus on the upstream evidence for an idea, because that's the real indicator of whether it's reliable. And the religions of the world have said, yeah, but our ideas impact the way we feel and treat one another, and the way we our psychological health. So if I believe that God will care for me, that's enormously reassuring and can boost my emotional well-being.
Right.
So the religions of the world, I think, and many of the world's spiritual traditions actually try to, they trade in ideas that are essentially mind hacks, ideas that boost emotional or social well-being, even though oftentimes the evidence for them is not particularly good.
Why do you say it's religions that do that and not philosophy? I think that's philosophy's job, is it not? And the way I look at religion is it was humanity's first attempt at philosophy. It's kind of how I look at it. Well, because
there's a lot to that.
You know what I mean? Yeah, it's our first attempt at healthcare in a sense that we prayed for the sick. I mean, it's an attempt to undo what we currently see albeit it didn't work, right? Like bloodletting, but we eventually had the Renaissance, and then here we are today.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Well, professional philosophers, theologians, but also just ordinary everyday people are kind of attuned to the usefulness of ideas. And we try to fill our minds with useful ideas and try to weed out the useless or the counterproductive ones. But it turns out that if you focus only on the usefulness of ideas and don't pay enough attention to the evidence that makes it reliably true or not, your mind can start to lose its grip on reality. I argue in the book that both religion and science have a piece of the deep truth here, that ideas have both have relationships both to upstream evidence and to downstream behaviors.
Right.
We need to be sensitive to both sets of relationships if we want to become genuinely wise.
So both so idea, downstream behavior. Of course, I have an idea about something and I behave in a certain manner. What was the upstream again?
Evidence. So what are the objective considerations that might render it likely to be true or not?
Yeah. So let's take on the big one then, which is religion. That's kind of the biggest one, I think, still. So people have argued ad nauseum for their own religion, right? So, and it seems clear to me that depending on wherever you were born in the world, if you are susceptible to believing in a type of spirituality, you're likely going to believe the one that the community around you, right? So given that logic, isn't it obvious that there is no one true religion, that in actual fact it is a potentially useful or detrimental system for living? So, so one should immediately therefore conclude that, oh, my religion isn't the one true religion. But
yeah, I end up arguing not for the abolition of the world's religions, but for their reformation.
Okay.
I think religions have long been in the business of trying to induce beneficial mindsets. So think about the concept of faith. Yeah. Sometimes we use the word faith to just mean like a positive outlook on the world, a hopefulness, trust. Hopefulness, trust, positive outlook. These are very, very valuable things.
Yeah.
They almost define mental health. And so if we can use the concept of faith to induce these, some scientists call them pro-social attitudes. So if you tend to trust one another, that's conducive to healthy social relationships. And if the concept of faith can get us to trust each other and to be more resolutely hopeful, great. That's the kind of faith I can get behind. Right. But when faith becomes an excuse for indulging in irresponsible beliefs, it becomes a problem. And it becomes a problem not just for you, because your worldview might diverge from reality. It becomes a problem for the people around you. You're sowing the seeds of ideological division if you indulge in such things. So I argue that we need to distinguish good faith and bad faith, and let go of bad faith and focus on promoting good faith.
I'm still concerned with the fact that, if you have a religious edict, that often tends to sit above law of the land. But I can see, I like the idea of reformation of religion. That is interesting because I can see sort of a journey of religion, the very early phases of it. I mean, that's a nonsense, but you're trying to make sense of the world, the knowledge of good and evil, right? Eating of the apple, temptation, therefore something bad happens when one is tempted, right? So that's the very beginning of the book. It's like, okay, I can see people are struggling with trying to figure that out. Nice. But there are phases of hatred for sodomy, for example, which has led to persecution of gays. So good, you can do without that. And then as it goes, through the 10 Commandments, for example, there's only 3 that are really good moral edicts. The rest of them are kind of, don't worship foreign gods and things like this. It's okay. Well, we're getting better, aren't we, though? We got 3 out of 10. So that's working. The Book of Proverbs is very interesting. I used to have that memorized at one point in life. And so there's some really great gems in there. But then we have the New Testament. It's like, oh, okay, now we're reforming even more.
Good. And so you're right. I mean, religions have evolved, and they have evolved in the direction of, I think, they're more morally more conducive to treating one another well than they used to. Just compare the Old Testament and the New Testament, right?
Right.
So that's true. I actually argue in the book that, like you, I don't think many of the Ten Commandments are really particularly well thought out. I mean, surely God could have done better if he put his mind to it.
Sure.
In the book, I argued that there was a real missed opportunity when God didn't declare the following idea, a commandment.
Okay. Right.
Always yield to better reasons. Thou shalt yield to better reasons.
Yeah, wouldn't that have been amazing?
Well, if everybody followed that commandment, we would dialogue in ways that we cannot even currently imagine. Our minds would function at so much higher level. The sciences would flourish. Our problem solving would take off. Our procedural justice would become profoundly more satisfying and more just. When everybody yields to better reasons, it works out really well for everyone. When people start defying better reasons, the way our former president did for 4 years, you basically subvert mental immune systems.
So yield to better reason, don't define a better reason.
Don't defy.
Or defy. Okay, defy a better reason. Yeah.
Right. If you give me a better reason why I should change my mind, and I just say, to hell with you, I prefer my ideas, I'm not just subverting our dialogue and its potential to educate, I'm also subverting my own mental health.
Yeah, that's right. It's likely about power and control, isn't it, for people in authority, right?
And when you feel powerless, it can be hard to be open to new ideas because the beliefs you have might seem like one of the only things you have going for you, right? So think about the people who've been systematically disadvantaged by the internet economy. They just feel left behind. Okay. If you're feeling that way, you're likely to feel resentful. And when people come along and say, hey, those ideas, when these pointy-headed academics like me come along and say, hey, you really need to rethink some of your core ideas here, you're likely to say, those ideas define my identity, and I need that. So get out of my face, buddy.
Okay. I love this subject because this is, so my wife, if she were here, she would roll her eyes at this because she's like, Eddie, it just doesn't work like that. But this is, in my simplistic view, this is kind of how it works.
All right.
So with the internet and the dot-com boom, I was teaching English language in Canada in the Rocky Mountains, earning $26,000 a year, having a baby and kind of desperate for coin, right? Feeling left behind, certainly feeling out of the cool kids club, feeling like, I had a bunch of mates in technology. They were moving it. Some people were this was back in the day where people were just registering www.whatever so that they could sell that URL because they knew a company would want it, like Coca-Cola's URL or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So I have to say, I'll put it crudely, instead of bitching and whining about it, I just rolled up my sleeves and said, okay, I'm going to get into technology. And I did. Right, I got into technology, started earning great money, started contributing, and I like to, this just sounds so arrogant, but it's not. I like to say that I pay more taxes in 1 year than a lot of people pay in their lifetime. Right, so it's like, am I special to have done that? No, anybody could do that. This is the bit my wife rolls her eyes at. Anybody could have just said, okay, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and get on with it.
Right.
So I have a lack of empathy, I must say, for people who feel disenfranchised by, let's say, the internet economy, because there's no barriers to entry here, people. There really isn't. It's the internet. So just get on and start doing something.
So hey, can I half agree with you on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get. I just want to mention John Dela Cruz's comment here. John, thanks for joining us, man. Me too. I'm loving this conversation. Okay, but yeah, please respond to that because I haven't been able to work it out in my head as to how I can have more empathy for people who are disenfranchised.
Well, so I think you're right that the victim mentality it doesn't serve people well. When you just feel persecuted and victimized and you just rely on that as a crutch or as an excuse and a way to just complain, a lot of times your mental energy doesn't go towards the very real opportunities that are out there to improve your lot. So that I would agree with that part. But I think at one point you said, anybody can be successful this way. You're right that there are enormous opportunities out there.
Okay.
And you and I have advantages that not everybody shares. We have white skin. We're men. These give us advantages that some people lack. If you, Eddie, or me had grown up in a family that couldn't even put food in the table, our brains would be underdeveloped. And we might not even be able to understand the kind of complexity that you have to grasp to become successful using the internet. So I'm quibbling only with the anyone can do this thing. I like the aspirational nature of that way of putting it, but from the truth test, from the evidence test, I'd urge you just a little bit more cautious framing.
So what do I do with the following anecdotal evidence? It's anecdotal. They made a movie out of this guy, Will Smith played him. It was called The Pursuit of Happiness, Chris Gardner. So here's a guy, right, African-American man who grew up very poor. I mean, we're talking about the hood. I actually read his biography. I didn't just watch the movie because I found it fascinating. One scene that wasn't in the movie, this poor guy gets raped. He wakes up with a shotgun in his mouth from his stepfather. I mean, this kind of life. He became a stockbroker, multimillionaire, bankrolled his local church, something like $100 million in San Francisco to build this amazing community center. Okay, now his story is all about, grit and drive and the kind of thing that I love, right? That kind of stuff. And so, well, that would seem to contradict the fact that, us with white skin and male have an advantage because he did it. Oprah did it. She had a rough upbringing.
Right. So there are certainly heartwarming stories of people of color or women becoming successful. And that doesn't mean, so that shows us, but let's be careful about what that shows. That shows us that having black skin or being a woman isn't an automatic disqualifier for success in our society.
Right.
But if you look at, but the real way to think correctly about this is statistically. And statistically, people who grow up in poverty have a much harder time becoming financially successful. Statistically, women have a harder time than men becoming financially successful. And statistically, people of color have a much harder time becoming successful than people with white skin. So you can't rely on anecdotes or particular instances and generalize to the general situation.
So in my mind, and so you tell me where in my mind the mental immunity is perhaps either working or not working. Because one person did it, it's possible for and one person who was extremely disadvantaged, like Chris Gardner or Oprah, it means it's possible, not probable, possible that anyone can do it.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong to say that. It's just that there are different kinds of possibility. So logicians will distinguish logical possibility, which means consistent with the laws of logic, physical possibility, which means consistent with the laws of physics. And then there are other kinds of possibility that take certain things for granted. And, given this set of givens, is it possible? Well, it depends. So there are different kinds of possibility. It's certainly logically possible for anybody to become as wealthy as Oprah.
Right.
It's even consistent with the laws of physics for even the poorest person of color to become as rich as Oprah. Right. But if in fact, say, malnourishment has stunted your brain, or, and by the way, I want to be clear here. I don't for a moment think that all people of color
understand
match this, but if with sufficient economic and psychological disadvantages, the task of becoming successful can become one where most of us wouldn't have the stick-to-itiveness or the discipline to do it. And I think we need to be compassionate and sympathetic.
It seems that way, that most people just don't do it. And yeah, compassion is a better You mean, I've got that little bit of a come on, let's go kind of attitude. But yeah, and that's not to be mistaken with being incompassionate either.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And you're right to say that, the idea, come on, you can do this. You can do this too, is a valuable message to send. But when that very same attitude is used to say, well, you didn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, to heck with you, then it becomes problematic because.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I agree, exactly. Well, because if you look at all, so on the subject of great speech, right, and polishing ourselves on hitting the keynote, look at the great TED Talks. The great TED Talks, these kinds of things aren't, I had a miserable story and that's the end. It's I had a miserable story and I overcame.
Yeah.
Right.
These are some of the best stories, and we all need to hear those success stories, right?
Yeah.
Those are important. Yeah. And I do think a lot of times a success story, a person behind a success story will get some media attention, and they'll come out with the following platitude: you can be anyone you want. You can do anything you want.
Right.
And yeah, it's inspirational to say that, but view that through the lens of evidence and logic, and it really doesn't hold up.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
I could not be a center in the NBA. I could not be that, no matter how desperately I wanted to be.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and through no sort of lack of trying on my part, I am not nearly the man that I have in my head. Right. I mean, I haven't achieved my goals, right? Not by far. And it's very frustrating now that I'm kind of, it's funny because I'm at this first time in this point in my life, I'm 48 years old, where I now have pretty much a little bit more history behind me as I do runway in front of me. Right. I've just tipped over. And it's an interesting place, Andy. So I'm having a little bit of an existential crisis with that, I must admit.
I'm right there with you, Eddie.
Yeah. Because that's the first time I'm kind of thinking, oh, hang on. The hourglass with the sand, there's more in the bottom, just a little bit, than there is in the top now. So you just start thinking very differently about life, and you start thinking about opportunities lost, right? People don't like saying regrets, do they? But I don't know why they don't like saying regrets. It's like I can see things in my life that I should have done, I didn't do, and I regret not doing it.
Yeah, and you're also, I think, touching on a really fascinating. We all need to be real. Realism is a virtue. If your worldview becomes hopelessly idealistic, that becomes a problem. You need to have your feet firmly planted in reality to function well in this world. But we also need optimism to pull us forward, to drive us forward. And a lot of times when the world is just plain being depressing, it's hard to be both realistic and optimistic. How do you combine those?
Right.
I'm actually convening a group of a few dozen scientists in a couple of weeks to discuss this very problem. How do you remain optimistic and realistic and not become cynical? It's a hugely fascinating problem. And when we all wrestle with it in an existential way every day almost.
Well, it's actually the reason I started this podcast, because so the company I work for, I'm a full-time keynote speaker, so I seem to do that very well. Okay, great. We obviously want to replicate me and make lots of, and there are other great keynote speakers within the organization, but we have quite a few thousand employees, and there's quite a few who are ambitious enough to become great speakers. And in a certain sense, I mean, you can see, some folks, for some reason you just don't have the polish. But I'm wondering where, and this is season 2, if you can create amazing content, do you need the polish? Probably not. Right.
Well, look at me. Look at my lack of photogenic. I don't have your mellifluous British accent, but I have worked hard at polishing at least a small number of ideas to the point where they might just be useful to people. So maybe I'm a living example. You don't have to be particularly.
Well, but there might be some folks who say, hey, Eddie, or maybe not, let's not use me, Tony Robbins, I could never get to your sort of standard. Well, maybe that's not necessary. And by the way, I kind of like what Malcolm Gladwell said. I think it was in Tipping Point, or it might have been Blink. We talked about you don't study the people on the edge of the bell curve, because these are the exceptions, right? So the Tony Robbins of these world, the Elon Musks. Right, we write books about these people, right? Everybody else is in the middle of the bell curve. I'm in there somewhere. I'm not on the tail end, right? Yep. And so, they're anomalies, these people. So studying them, I've read a lot of biographies. And I think now, looking back, it was for entertainment. It was beautiful to read, right? I've read biographies of so many technologists, right, and business people. And in hindsight, what has that actually taught me, or has that created me into an amazing business athlete? It's probably helpful, but at the end of the day, it's been entertainment, I think, because Elon Musk is Elon Musk. I mean, come on. Right?
we can't all be Elon Musk, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then so you'll hear this with people too, who will then say, like, about Steve Jobs. I just finished another one of his biographies, as a matter of fact, where the guy was a real asshole. And it's just like, you're saying that because you can't be him. It almost seems like, I wouldn't want to be him even if I could be, but I can't be. So I'll say that the guy was a real, ding dong at work. And it's like, well, you don't even need to say that. We don't need to judge him that way, because he's his own entity.
Yeah.
Right? You can be something else. But how to install the confidence is not quite right, but how to make people think in such a manner that they have the mental immunity and strength to be their own person. And this is what I think truly comes out. I've got some friends, and they frankly are the people that really organized TED into what it is today. And they've started their own company to kind of do more with podcasts. And they said the thing that they told every one of their TED speakers: be authentic. Just be as authentic as you can possibly be. Like they said that's the biggest secret to public speaking. And I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah, and I think when we see somebody speaking in a way that's inauthentic, we can feel it, right?
Right.
And that's just not as compelling. You need to speak from the heart, and all the best messages come from the heart, right? Well, which isn't to say that the head isn't involved. We need our hearts to be in the right place and our heads to be in the right place. But yeah.
It's challenging for sales teams. So the majority of the audience, who will watch this podcast will be sales professionals. Now, they have to be authentic about a product that they didn't create, that they probably know in the marketplace is to say you've got the very best product in the entire world. It's like, do you really? Because we all know that there's probably a handful of the best products, right? Coca-Cola and Pepsi. I can't taste the difference, right? I hate them both, as a matter of fact. It's all sugar water to me. But it's which one's the best product? They're both the same. But if you're working for Coca-Cola, you have to say, mine's the best. Now you've immediately moved to inauthenticity. You've immediately gone there. So how does one remain authentic while representing a conversation where, you have to say you're the best at something when you know full well you're not?
Right. So I think it was Sinclair Lewis, the novelist, who said it's very hard to get a man to question something if his salary depends on his not questioning. Something like that.
Exactly.
Right.
That's right.
And so our professional responsibilities can actually put pressure on our mental immune systems. They can actually partially compromise our mental immune systems. So, and then we have a conflict between being the best salesman we can be, say, or best salesperson we can be, and being the best person we can be. And sometimes those clash, right? And the solutions aren't always easy, but I know many people who've compromised their ethics for business success, and they almost always regret it. And I know other people who always put doing the right thing first, and I've never met a single one of them who ended up feeling bad about that. And this goes all the way back to ancient Greece, when my man Socrates basically said, or one of the characters in Plato's dialogues said, you know what, I try to do the right thing every time, and I sleep better at night.
Really? Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, the way our system is set up is, Wall Street rewards profitability over everything else. It's just the way the system is set up. Now, I like to say I'm a capitalist, but I do look at that and I go, that's not capitalism. That's a different animal. That's something else. I don't know what.
And we need to get past this idea that capitalism is either good full stop or bad full stop. It's clear that capitalism has generated enormous amounts of wealth and well-being. And it's also true that capitalism has some weird, perverse effects that are damaging our planet, damaging our collective well-being. So we need to stop treating everybody as though they're blind capitalists or simple communists or socialists. The fact is, we need well-functioning markets have guardrails. If you don't design markets, they don't do a good job of satisfying needs. And the exact same thing is true of the marketplace of ideas. If we just assume that a free-for-all of ideas is going to work out best for everyone, or if we just assume that Mark Zuckerberg gets to decide for all of us which ideas get play and which ones don't, it's not going to work out well for us. We need to create an information commons that promotes deep dialogue and real reflection. And then we can get back to flourishing together. But that's going to require some content moderation. The healthiest online communities are ones where content moderators create environments where people listen and learn from one another rather than flame each other. And if we don't do that with the world's big information systems, our species is in for a really rough ride in coming decades.
I do want to talk more about that. I want to go back first because that's an interesting one. Because who's doing the moderating? That's the big question, right? And so that's it's like when I say who's doing the moderating, where are they really thinking and coming? What motivates them? I want to rewind a little bit because when you were mentioning how people, you said you mentioned the Plato quote on something along the lines, and I'll paraphrase that, if you make the right decision, you'll feel good, right? At the end of the day, if you don't compromise yourself. This is what I used to tell. I used to train sales teams. I used to say, one of the things I love about the sales profession is that if you improve yourself as a human being, you can improve your bottom line because people buy from decent people. So the way I've overcome the lack of, let's say, the lack of the inauthenticity behind saying, hey, I get paid by this company, therefore I have to say they're the best, right, is I actually say, well, look, in actual fact, so if I'm talking to CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, I will say, look, there are independent analysts that will rate my company as well as a handful of other companies as being among the best in the world. So I'm in the category of consideration. And let's just say it's equally with these other 3 or 4 companies. Okay, because there's a firm called Gardner that does this top right-hand quadrant we always talk about. Okay, so I'm one of, let's say, 6 players that you could buy, and more than likely any one of these 6 players would suffice. Now already I'm standing on dangerous ground with the corporation that pays my mortgage, of course, right? Because I have to wave their flag. This is how I wave it. So then I say the distinguishing factor comes in the people that are serving you at that corporation. So if you as a customer have a problem at 2 o'clock in the morning, your internet's gone down, you've got a firewalling problem, you're under a ransomware attack, you need to be able to pick up the phone to a human being immediately. So your decision criteria is not just in that how good is the technology to beat back the ransomware attacks, but it's in actual fact in having an amazing human being that's dedicated, that's going to pick up the phone at 2 a.m., that cares about your problem. And who is that person? It's actually, yes, the CEO cares, but it's actually the frontline sales rep, right? Because that's the person who's phoning. You don't have the CEO's number, right? This is a guy that runs an entire organization. I mean, not every customer in the world can call this person, but you can call that dedicated sales rep. Yes. So that's your most important relationship. Now, if that person's an amazing human being, you should pick us because more than likely you're going to have a good time.
And like you, Eddie, I think I have a sort of a sensitive inauthenticity detector on board. And so if you actually practice the art of idea testing enough, you become very sensitive to bullshit. And you become much less susceptible to sketchy sales pitches. So invest in your mental immune system, right, and you'll waste fewer dollars on low quality products or services. You'll have more ammunition drive to go with some of the really good options, the options that will really serve you well. You'll become more sensitive to propaganda, less likely to succumb to it. You're less likely to fall into a conspiracy theory rabbit hole. The investing in your mental immune health is, I mean, the whole concept of mental immunity is kind of brand new. I mean, scientists have been nibbling around the edges of it for decades, and like we could talk about that research history. But there's, I think, this new frontier of how we can actually develop mental immunity so that we all become better decision makers. And a mind that is full of half-truths or falsehoods will not make good decisions. But a mind that is very sensitively aware of the drawbacks of ideas, and as well as their good features, will just habitually make better decisions. And I love it's certainly possible that, you know, the service component of a service technology package is superior, and you're well within your rights as a salesman to draw your potential clients' attention to that using a reason, right?
Right. Now, that's interesting too, because so as a consumer of any product, let alone cybersecurity, there's a plethora of products you can buy. So, and every single one of them in the advertising says best. So you have to fortify your mental immunity in order to see through the bullshit, as you just said, to figure out, well, what is the criteria for examining the product so that I can distinguish which one is best?
Exactly. And those are the kind of questions that a healthy mental immune system poses and then goes off in search of answers for.
And it would behoove the company who's selling the best products to strengthen their mental immunity so that they can present that information in an articulate and logical manner to the end user, right? To the user of the product.
Absolutely. Yeah. And honestly, I think when you talk about authenticity, I think that investing in your mental immune health is a good way to become a more authentic person.
Absolutely.
And by extension, a better salesman.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think what happens is I still do this all the time, I'm embarrassed to say, you know, we hear an idea, it sounds amazing, and then I'll find myself at a dinner party repeating the idea as if it's my own, not necessarily claiming it as my own, not plagiarism, but in the sense that I haven't wrestled with it yet, and then somebody else will destroy it, and then I feel like a schmuck because it really wasn't. I didn't own the idea. So you're like a reed getting blown in the wind. Whenever you hear a strong idea come across, you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I'll go down this path a little bit, you know. And
it's very easy to do that, right? Very smart, well-meaning people can be seduced by really interesting ideas. And here I'm tempting people with this seductive idea of mental immunity, but I've also put in, 25 years testing this idea and subjecting it to some of the toughest questioning. I mean, my philosopher buddies rake my ideas over the coals and make me go back to the drawing board again and again and again. And you develop thick skin. You have to survive in an environment like that. But we philosophers, often we aren't the most popular people at dinner parties because we like to test ideas. That's why Socrates was invited to drink hemlock, right? He was too hard on other people's ideas.
Be careful who's pouring the wine at your next dinner party, Andy. Let's finish with this because we're over time, but I could keep doing this. This is so fantastic. Going back then to moderating for healthy discussion, let's put it that way.
Yes.
My problem I wrestled with this so much that I keep just going back to First Amendment, let her rip, just say whatever, because I can't figure out. So I agree with you. Moderating so that you can have healthy discussion is needed. But as soon as we put a moderator in the room, that person has an agenda. Of course they have an agenda. And with the tech companies, they all lean one way politically. So this will not work. I mean, so how do we solve for this?
Yeah, I mean, so the question is often framed, I think, the way you framed it earlier: who gets to decide? And I'm in no way in favor of appointing anyone, certainly not me, as the arbiter of what everybody else gets to think and say. But the answer, but it's also true that we can't just kick the can down the road and assume that the question will work itself out. The fact is, the answer to the question is, we have to say which ideas are the good ones and which ideas are the bad ones, which kind of contributions to a conversation really should be included in the moderated discussion, and which ideas probably shouldn't be because they because the costs of allowing it are too high. I'm saying that we collectively need to figure out what we need to come to shared standards of accountable talk, and then gently and non-coercively enforce them so that we have productive discussions rather than the kind of animus that's right now tearing too many people apart.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy question. And especially when there are huge disparities in influence over the structure and design of the information ecosystem, it becomes a really thorny problem. And I don't claim to have all the answers, but I do know this: we as a species must collectively figure out how to promote more accountable talk, or many very dark days lie ahead.
Let's end on that note, because you know what? I've got so much more to say, but that's a powerful moment. Andy, I'd love to have you back a few months from now on season 3, because I'm quite certain I'm going to get a lot of feedback. And yeah, mental immunity. So wonderful. Thank you so much for your service, for your work, Andy. I think it's great. Flash up the book if you've got it there, just to kind of show people. I don't know if you're a good man. Thank you. There we go.
Thank you.
Mental Immunity by Andy Norman. And it'll be in the show notes when I produce the actual podcast and put it on Spotify. There'll be a link to Amazon and wherever we find it. And so thank you. Stay right there as I end the broadcast so that I can debrief with you. But ladies and gentlemen, hope you loved that one, because I certainly did. Thanks, Andy. Fantastic.